And I'm delighted that Freddie New has taken the time to join us. Freddie is the co-founder and chief policy officer of Bitcoin Policy UK, along with Susie, and is front and center of the effort to wrap sensible legislation around Bitcoin while building trust and communicating the benefits of this new form of money to policymakers and regulators alike. So what we'll do is a quick introduction from Freddie, and we'll run through a number of popular concerns, certainly ones that I get to do with Bitcoin, and then we'll talk in a bit more detail about regulation in the UK, good and bad, and then we'll leave quite a long time for questions from you guys. And afterwards, please join us for a drink upstairs. So, without any further ado, Freddie, how did you get here? Tell us.
Well, immediately tonight, it was the invitation from yourself, so thank you very much for that. Very, very kind of you. More generally speaking, how did I get here in terms of my interest in Bitcoin and where I am at the moment? So professionally, I started life as an M&A lawyer, very dull, and I tried very hard to escape that for a long time. Interestingly, as part of that, the first time I think I came across Bitcoin was the Cypriot banking crisis in 2013. So I was at Ropes and Gray at the time, writing a paper on the bank bail-ins. And as part of the research for that, I came across this unconfiscatable kind of money, thought it was quite interesting. And because I'm an idiot, I didn't buy any in 2013, which is one of the reasons I'm here now and not on a tropical island somewhere. And then a couple of years later, I came across it again, this time in the context of hardware and software. So I've always been a bit of a geek. In addition to being a lawyer, you can tell I was really popular at parties when I was young. I used to build computers for fun, and I realized that this Bitcoin thing that I'd come across a couple of years ago hadn't died yet. And so I began reading a bit more about it. I just built a gigantic liquid-cooled gaming computer, and I thought, I'm going to start mining Bitcoin now. I'm going to become a millionaire. And again, I didn't know what I was doing. ASIC miners had come out about a year before, and it was at that time impossible to mine profitably using a graphics card, even on my enormous computer. But I lost a lot of money, I think, on electricity costs. But it was an interesting experience, and I started running a node, and actually I'm still running 3 nodes today. So that was sort of roughly my way in, and then maintained that interest ever since.
As you look back, was it, did the attraction come from the idea of Bitcoin as a sort of practical form of new money, or was there a moral dimension, or?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think your approach or your interest in Bitcoin probably depends on who you are and what you want to use it for. So if, for example, you are a refugee fleeing across a border, leaving a war zone, and you're trying to bring something with you, you can cross the border with 12 words in your head, and that money that you have with you is encapsulated in those 12 words. We can go into exactly what that means if that's of any use. You can recreate your wallet on the other side of that border and flee from a war zone with all of your property with you. If you are a teacher in Afghanistan, for example, trying to educate women, and I've worked with someone who actually does this, a lady called Roya Mahoob, she pays women in Afghanistan teaching girls illegally under the Taliban regime. She pays them in Bitcoin. If you are an asset manager trying to diversify your portfolio and you want to allocate 1% of your capital into a money that's not tied to governments or sovereign liabilities, that's a completely different aspect. So I think the use case of Bitcoin really depends on who you are and what you might want to use it for.
Yeah. So which brings us to the sort of issue of what is it for in the Western world, in the sense that, we have these conferences, we already have money systems here. How does Bitcoin assimilate itself into the sort of financial system that we have in the West? When there's obviously a practical use case in emerging markets, in troubled markets, but how do you see that changing in the Western economies?
If I wanted to be really punchy about it, I'd say that Bitcoin is potentially a hedge against sovereign debt default. And that's quite important to unpack and to understand. I think you really need to go into what the nature of money is. And this is not something that we typically think about very much, even at universities when we're studying economics. Almost all modern money is a liability, whether of a central bank or of a commercial bank. Most modern money is created when banks make loans. And that is fine in a certain context, but it has an ultimately dilutive effect on the value of all other money that's previously in existence and in circulation. You probably see an increasing chatter over the last few weeks and months of the gigantic amounts of sovereign debt. France is obviously in a terrible pickle at the moment, and I'd argue that we're not that far behind in the UK. Just to put a few numbers on it, we already spend more on debt interest repayments on our sovereign debt than we spend on defense or on education. In fact, we spend nearly twice simply on servicing our debt than we do on education. This year, I think we're going to hit 110 billion straight out of the door just on the coupon. That's not paying down the principal. So if you believe that governments are going to continue printing their currency, which in my expectation they absolutely will, having a portion of your wealth allocated to an asset that they can't print more of, they can't control, and they can't dilute is, in my view, a relatively prudent thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I we'll get into that a bit later, but a bit more later, because what I'm really keen to explore is not how brilliant Bitcoin is, because I think we agree on that. It's the difficulty it will have reaching wider adoption. So one of the things I'd like to do is try and address some of the objections or the difficulties I get a lot when I talk to people. And of course, the security of money is paramount, as it should be. And a lot of people come up to me and go, well, it's the most wonderful technology and so forth, but quantum computers are going to come and wipe it out. Is that true?
Well, I think you should, if someone said that to you, you should just turn your back and leave immediately, because they're clearly a clown. I mean, being slightly more serious about it, it's important to understand what they mean by quantum being a threat to Bitcoin. So without being too technical, I think people often say that without understanding how the system functions. So again, without going too deeply down the rabbit hole of public-private key cryptography, there are probably two attack vectors for a quantum computer to hit the Bitcoin system. One is in terms of reverse engineering a private key from a public key. Now, everyone in the room probably knows that all public addresses are searchable by anyone in the world, but it's impossible at the moment to reverse engineer a private key from public addresses. The reason private keys are so important is because Bitcoin can only be moved, that is, a transaction can only be broadcast to the network if you sign that transaction with a private key. And actually, if you go back to the white paper, Satoshi defined a Bitcoin as a chain of digital signatures. So that it's nothing more than that. Effectively, it's a system of cryptographically signed messages. So it's important to think about the point at which we might hit a cryptographically relevant quantum computer. In order to, and again, I think an easy way of doing this without being too technical is to think about the amount of computing power that you would need in order to reverse engineer a private key from a public key. I think we chatted in the previous.
Yeah, go on, say it again.
Okay,
because it's big.
Well, it's quite a fun mind game. So imagine you could make a perfect computer that would run at pretty much absolute zero, and you're going to build a Dyson sphere around the sun. So you will be able to harness all of the energy output of that star, and you will run your perfect computer at the fastest it is possible under the laws of physics for a computer to run. Now, the SHA-256, which is the algorithm which underpins Bitcoin, it's called SHA-256 because the cryptography is secured by an absolutely gigantic number, 2 to the power of 256. Now, our perfect computer is going to do nothing but count. It's going to count as fast as it can, and it's going to try and count to the number that is 2 to the 256. Even with the full energy output of that star, it would not be able to count to that number before the heat death of the universe. So,
It's a long wait.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So in terms of reverse engineering, we're pretty safe. And there is a quantum attack, sorry to ramble on, but
No, it's
I think it's important to unpack the other attack vectors. That a probably more significant attack vector is what happens when you broadcast a transaction. When you, typically the older addresses will also broadcast an unhashed version of the private key when a transaction is broadcast to the network. And there's a worry that quantum computers might be able to effectively intercept that broadcast of the private key and therefore drain those wallets. Now, that's not all wallets. The more modern wallets, which start with BCH in their designation, don't have that vulnerability. Satoshi's wallet, the Genesis wallet, interestingly does. That's one of the old wallets. It starts with a 1 designated, and that could arguably be quantum vulnerable if a transaction is made from that wallet. Until that transaction is broadcast to the mempool, even they would be safe. And again, if you want any more reassurance on quantum, I'd go back to Adam Back. Most people in the room will probably know who Adam Back is. He was famous in the 1970s and 80s in the privacy wars when cryptography was designated as a munition by the United States government. Back was then writing code on the T-shirts and walking through airports with it. And he was instrumental in Phil Zimmerman's efforts to push back against the US government. Eventually, they published the PGP code in a book, and that was subject to First Amendment protection, and eventually the US government dropped that case. Back is the only person whose work is cited by Satoshi in the white paper. He was the inventor of Hashcash, which really was a precursor for the proof of work algorithm that Bitcoin uses. Back is very dismissive of quantum vulnerability. He talks about the two attack vectors that we have, and he returns time and again to a quantum vulnerable or quantum relevant computer. And he is very much of the view that people are already working on quantum protection, and a long time before it becomes an issue for Bitcoin, it will be fixed. And bear in mind that if it happens, everything else is vulnerable first. Bitcoin is the most secure computing system the world has ever seen. Long before this happens, nuclear missile silos are going to be opened, and we're going to have a lot of other things to worry about.
Yeah. There's a reason why we're recording this, so you can all go back and look at it again, and then see if you can wrap your.
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, but I think we get the point. Yeah, and it's an important point because it's frequently cited in the press and everywhere else as a problem. But thank you very much for that. The other issue, of course, which has been long-standing, I think for people like you and me, we kind of think it's yesterday's news, but it's not, is Bitcoin's use of energy. And from my perspective, what's been so interesting in the last 2 or 3 years is how this argument has started to flip round to the other side. And I'd love you to explain a bit more about what you see and how Bitcoin mining can play a constructive part in the kind of energy story.
Well, this is a really fascinating piece. And again, I don't want to be too geeky and bore everyone. I think first principle is important to remember that Bitcoin mining is a zero emissions business. It's running a computer, you put electricity in and you get heat out, plus Bitcoin if you're lucky. So Bitcoin mining as an industry does not emit any carbon. What does emit carbon in some respects is the way that our electricity is generated. And that's actually a really interesting area in which Bitcoin mining can be relevant in terms of building out a sustainable grid. It may surprise you to know that before I started working in Bitcoin, I knew nothing about how the grid functions. and honestly, I didn't expect to learn. And I've got incredible respect for the people who balance electricity grids. It's the old story at half-time when England's playing, you go to the kitchen, flick a kettle on, and suddenly there's an enormous spike in electricity demand. There are people who are making sure that that demand at all times perfectly matches supply. Extraordinary feat of engineering that we're just blind to be honest. The interesting thing about sustainable or renewable grids is that the more intermittency you introduce into the grid system, for example, through wind and solar, which are great when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing, the more intermittency you introduce, the more demand response you need to have. So you need to do two things to a sustainable grid. One is you need to have a lot of overbuild. So you need, because it's intermittent, you need to have more supply than you may need at low times. And secondly, you also need to have something to soak up the excess supply when demand is low. Weirdly, Bitcoin miners seem to be an extraordinarily useful technology for helping to manage sustainable grids and make sure that you don't get blackouts or brownouts. This is already being used very successfully in Texas. Miners will co-locate with wind farms and with solar plants. Wind farms, Texas is weirdly one of the world leaders in wind energy. And because they're co-located and they have legal agreements with the generation plants, they can flick off within seconds and release power back to the grid. Another interesting thing about the economics of mining is that it's really not viable to compete with other users of power. So, because your margins are so tight as a Bitcoin miner, you're not going to be mining commercially at home. In the UK is a good example. Our electricity is so expensive, there's virtually no mining here at all. So they look for areas of stranded or wasted power. What is happening in Africa, for example, absolutely fascinating. Is anyone familiar with gridless? You are. Oh, there we go. What gridless are doing is absolutely fascinating. It's a startup, been running for 3 or 4 years now. They have pinpointed that there's an awful lot of locations in Africa which have stranded or wasted energy. So a lot of run-of-river hydro, a lot of small rivers, small dams that could provide power, but there's no economic incentive for electricity to be built out in those areas because they are off-grid, literally gridless. What gridless do is they identify these sites and they will go in and they will co-locate renewable generation with a mining facility. The mining facility helps to provide the initial seed capital for that new electricity generation. And you also end up with an electrified village or an electrified town, which wouldn't have had electrification were it not for the miners. And this is happening in Kenya, it's happening in Ethiopia. They're spreading out from Kenya as well into Malawi and also into Zambia as well. Those kind of stories completely pass us by in London, but that to me is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's totally fascinating. And it sort of can swing us nicely into kind of your conversations with regulators and legislators over here, in the sense that is that part of your argument for Bitcoin when you sit in front of politicians and policymakers, and what is the reception and what are the things that they're really interested in?
Well, the reason my forehead's very flat is because I've been banging it against walls and desks for quite a long time. If I had to describe Britain's approach to this in regulatory terms, it would be poor.
Chatham House.
Well, exactly. In the nicest way possible. I don't think a lot of these concepts are particularly familiar to our regulators or our politicians. One of our close contacts with Bitcoin Policy UK did engage in conversation with Miliband on particularly the energy issue, and I'll unpack why in a second. Miliband shut him down. He said, "But Bitcoin is useless," without bothering to listen to the rest of the piece. One reason that we have such high power costs in the UK is because of curtailment. You remember a second ago I mentioned the overbuild of renewable energy. Yeah. So the more wind farms we build, the more power is going to be generated when the wind is blowing. Unfortunately, that means that we need to pay those farms to turn off. Some more data. Last year, 37% of the wind power generated in Scotland couldn't be used. It couldn't be taken by the grid because the grid capacity wasn't there and there simply wasn't the demand for that power. So what happens, it's great for the generators because NESO, the National Energy Systems Operator, and Ofgem have agreed that you and I, the bill payers, will pay them to turn off. So when wind is curtailed, we are paying those farms to do nothing, and that is one of the reasons we have such high electricity costs in the UK. And our message to Miliband and to Chris Stark, who also ignores us, by the way, is very simple. Just do a feasibility study we're not even asking them to reach out to miners. Just do a feasibility study of what could happen if we managed to co-locate mining farms with wind generation, because the miners will take that power, they will pay you for it, and it means that everyone can enjoy cheaper bills, because at the moment those curtailment costs are going on our bills at home. I'm not quite sure why it's so difficult to get through to them, but we'll keep trying. And if anyone else wants to bang their heads on their doors, do feel welcome to do so.
What do you think changes that? I mean, are we going to have a sort of a grid out sort of problem like France and Spain saw last year? Was it earlier this year? It was earlier this year, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was earlier this year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, probably yes. I think there's no better way of learning that the stove is hot than to touch it. And unfortunately, humans seem to like touching stoves.
Yeah. I suppose the other side for Bitcoin's sort of adoption in the UK is this issue, and it's a kind of a motive issue. It's of having a new form of currency or money circulating around the economy. How do you address that? And is that an objection you get from policymakers? Are they aware of that? Do they have a difficulty with that? And how would you? How does one confront that? Because that's got to be a kind of challenge.
Yeah, I do think that's a real worry, probably more for the Bank of England than anyone else. If you dig back through the Bank of England's publications on CBDCs, for example, from a couple of years ago, there's a nice little nugget buried in the back of that, which says that the bank would not tolerate the emergence of another form of digital money. I think, unfortunately for the bank, whether they want to tolerate it or not, it's kind of here. And monetary history has shown that good money tends to drive out bad money, and these things very often get adopted from bottom up rather than top down. My own personal history, I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I very clearly remember everyone's desperate dash for hard currency. You wanted to get dollars or pounds. You wanted to get rid of Zimbabwe dollars. Zimbabwe itself has got rid of Zim dollars 5 or 6 times now, and each time the new currency also collapses rather sadly. So I think that is a real concern, but definitely a concern for the Bank of England, probably more so I think than regulators or policymakers. And actually, I'm not quite sure what the answer is to assuage the bank, other than to point out that other forms of money do already exist, and the best example that we have is one that we're all familiar with, which is gold sovereigns.
Yeah.
Gold sovereigns are obviously still legal tender. They are not issued by the Bank of England. So a gold sovereign is not the liability of the Bank of England. So I don't know if it would make the bank feel any better, but other forms of hard money do exist. And I think Bitcoin has a lot in, well, I'm obviously not the first person to say this, it's got a lot in common with gold, in that I mentioned earlier, most of our modern money is a form of liability. Bitcoin is no one's liability, gold is no one's liability, and gold and sterling have happily coexisted for a couple of 100 years now. So I think to reassure the bank or give them a bit of comfort, it's perfectly fine to have other systems of money, and they needn't necessarily be at odds with each other.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, Bitcoin has adopted the moniker of digital gold. Is that a description that is sufficient in your view?
I'd say it's gold that can move at the speed of light.
Yeah.
So for me, the really interesting thing about Bitcoin, well, one of the many interesting things, is that it's solved a settlement problem which has existed for us, I think, probably as long as the telegraph has existed. So the differential between transaction speed and settlement speed was obviously, prior to the invention of the telegraph, limited by the physical movement of what you were exchanging. And then when you have the invention of the telegraph, suddenly you have people being able to transact with each other at the speed of light, but final settlement takes a lot later. And actually, we were talking earlier, weren't we, Will, about that settlement of shares and how frustrating it is even today. You're looking at T+2, T+3. Bitcoin sometimes takes a bit of stick for being slow, but it has final settlement ordinarily in about 10 minutes, which is extraordinary when you think that we're still today dealing with share settlement that can take 3 days. So the fact that you have a hard-capped emerging monetary asset which can move at the speed of light opens up all kinds of exciting opportunities for the industry, I think.
Yeah. Just last one, and then we'll move on to Q&A. But we have got this date in the diary, which is the 8th of October, when ETNs are going to be permitted. Is that a big sea change in your view, or is that kind of just a sort of convenient adjustment from the regulator for holding companies and so forth?
Well, I like to think about how much the FCA protected us since the ETN ban came in. I think it was December 2020, effectively
October
2021.
October, yeah.
And so they made a big song and dance about restricting retail access to any form of exchange traded product which gave exposure to cryptocurrency. And then they were cheeky enough to include a number in. It's worth going back and looking at their predictions for how much they thought they were going to protect everyone. And I think knowing that they probably lost people hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds by their restriction. I think they have been pushed over the line with gritted teeth. Again, Will and I were chatting earlier. It's worth reading the press release from the FCA when they announced they were going to reallow retail access to ETNs. The chap clearly didn't want to be saying it. It was as though someone was holding a pistol to the back of his head, and he finished by saying, "But you could still lose all of your money." So I don't think they wanted it, but they've been driven by circumstance.
Yeah, yeah, but okay. So it's important, but it's not definitive in the sense that, I mean, I'm interested from the perspective of whether institutions will start to allocate in a diversified portfolios, which they have clearly been unable to do and unwilling to do for the last 5 years.
Well, I mean, one of my perpetual frustrations with this industry is that in the UK, we're very, very good at financial services. We're also very good at information technology. We should have been all over this industry from the beginning. And we've ultimately been, I think, unfairly prevented from dominating it by a half-blind regulator. And again, sorry to be rude to the FCA, but this is an industry that we should have been really, really at the forefront of, given the kind of expertise that we have in the city, and I'm sure in this room as well. So
is that a European thing as well? I mean, it seems like the Americans have just gone full 180 on this and going for sort of max adoption.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering that until the change in administration, America was not a good place to run a cryptocurrency business either. Unfortunately, the Biden administration seemed to have its financial decisions made for it by Elizabeth Warren, who is not the kind of person you want setting your financial regulatory rules. And even though Gary Gensler, I actually had a lot of time for Gensler. I think he was a thoughtful and sensible regulator, and he, I think, left to his own devices, would probably have come up with thoughtful and sensible regulation. But to your point around institutional capital, the ETFs in the United States are among the most successful financial products ever launched, both in terms of their total AUM and in terms of the amount of liquidity that we see there. And I'm a bit of a self-custody maximalist, but I do acknowledge that particularly for institutional capital or mandated capital, it's very hard to explain to your LPs that you might want to hold Bitcoin directly. So having an instrument, whether an ETF or a Bitcoin treasury company, that enables you to get price exposure of the asset without having to do the dirty business of looking after it yourself, I think is a sensible thing.
Fair enough. I don't think my investors would be very impressed if I had everything on a USB stick at home. Let's open the floor to any questions. Anyone? Yes, Simon.
I think I might say that gold was illegal in the United States in the early part of the 20th century.
Executive Order 6102.
Banned. What are the chances, do you think, of the same thing happening to cryptos?
That's an interesting question. So you're referring to Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102 in 1933, which outlawed the private ownership of gold. So That, I think, is relatively unlikely to occur. So it's important to look at the circumstances when that actually happened. Roosevelt effectively, I mean, America was essentially a dictatorship under Roosevelt at the time. So he had complete control of Congress, complete control of both houses of Congress, actually, and, well, yeah. So I think it's also important to look at the potential enforceability of that kind of action and the cost of that enforcement. So at the moment, you could, I mean, I like to use an absurd example. Parliament could obviously pass a law making gravity illegal. Parliament can do anything it likes, but that would be an absurd law and people would still fall downstairs. So the extent to which that could happen, firstly, I think is you get an enormous amount of pushback particularly from all of the institutional capital that's now exposed to Bitcoin and to crypto. Like we said, in the US, we've got pension funds, we have nation states investing in these ETFs. There's a gigantic wall of money there. Bitcoin alone is a $2 trillion asset, which is, gold, I think at the moment is about 16 or 17 trillion. So it's still tiny compared to gold, but it's significant. And I personally have absolutely no idea how on earth you would enforce that, because most again, using Bitcoin as an example as the biggest asset in the space, most of that is actually still in private hands and not even held by exchanges. I think if you were very, very worried about that kind of risk, you might look askance at the holdings from some of the concentrations of holding. Coinbase I'd cite as an example because they custody the Bitcoin for a lot of the ETFs. So if the United States did want to appropriate Coinbase's Bitcoin, that would be one thing that they could do. But again, there's a period between passing those laws and actually stopping the capital flight. And because it can move so fast, and like we said earlier, you withdraw to self-custody, destroy your hardware wallet, remember your 12 words, what are they going to do? Torture you? I think the cost of enforcement and the difficulty of enforcement make that a much, much harder prospect. So I think you're right. In short, I think it is a risk, but it would be much harder than to do for gold.
I mean, to what extent are they relying on stablecoin? I mean, in the future, as a source of funding for treasuries.
That's a fantastic question, and I think what the administration in the US are doing is very, very clever, and I don't think many people have figured out what they're doing yet. They've kind of brought stablecoin issuers within the fold, and my personal view is that we're seeing them planning for the next 150 years of dollar dominance. Tether is already a systemically important purchaser of US sovereign debt. Last year, you might want to fact check me on this, but I think they bought more treasuries last year than the nation state of Germany did. It's number 6. Good God. Okay, that's even bigger than I thought. So yes, I think they're using stablecoins and particularly Tether to make sure that US dollar hegemony continues and effectively exporting US inflation. Actually, I don't know if anyone saw, there's an interesting piece of news came out of Russia last week. They were talking, they were actually pinpointing that very point, that the US is going to use stablecoins in order to try and address its gigantic $37 trillion debt. Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, Tusha.
A couple of questions. Firstly, you mentioned Satoshi account number 1. What percentage of the holdings are by Satoshi as percentage of the Bitcoin? And how much is he sold down the last 10 years? And
About 1 million coins and absolutely none.
he's got a holding a million. What percentage is that? It's about 1/21%.
Yeah, so it's 21 million total, and in issue at the moment about 19 million, I think. But those wallets are publicly available and not a single coin is moved. Personally, I think Satoshi is almost certainly dead and those keys are burned.
The other thing you mentioned about is the holding by the various governments on treasury. I mean, the Americans are, and I understand there's adoption by a number of the states to start holding Bitcoins as treasury. and possibly the Chinese. Are the other nation states around the world holding?
Oh, well, do you know who number 3 is? It's us. It's... Hello, Jennifer. Sorry. But yeah, that's a great... Actually, Bhutan has been mining on a nation-state basis. They've got quite a decent chunk now. Paraguay, Ethiopia. The UK is in 3rd position. We hold 61,000 coins, which is about $5.5 billion worth.
Is that proven? They've identified the wallets.
Well, Susie's done a lot of work on this, actually. So if you want chapter and verse on this, grab Susie afterwards. She knows where she knows the wallet addresses. We've been able to... Actually, maybe we should throw you the mic if you want to.
Yeah, please do.
So what am I explaining, Freddie?
I think
Where they came from. So it,
where they
came from and where they are.
and what the little dust movements that you've been looking at. We think they've got the keys
so
because of those dust movements.
the keys are, well, we thought that they'd been lost for a long time, actually, and we found out that they're actually with a custodian called Kamenu. They have 61,250 that came in from Coinbase. It was a Chinese scam, and they converted it into Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin obviously got seized because, people think it's for criminals, and it isn't, because it can easily be traced and easily be seized. I mean, criminals would use the current financial system, not Bitcoin. So, sorry, do you have a question?
I was going to ask who actually owns it. Is it the government? Is it the police?
The police, isn't it? The police are actually...
Yeah, the Met Police have got it. So $5.5 billion, again, just to play with some numbers, is I think 2.5 years of the Met Police's entire budget.
Actually, no, do you know what? You said dollars, and I think it's actually closer to $7 billion. It's like $6.9 billion, yeah.
Good God. I mean, part of me...
Might sell some crime.
I was actually wondering, are we actually the 3rd largest holder, or are we the 2nd? Because do you remember Lola uncovered that the US didn't have as much as they thought they had?
Yeah, that's unclear as well. There's supposed to have been an audit of the US government's holdings, which again were mainly from confiscations, but the US Marshals keep on selling it. So I think it's actually unclear
it's
how much.
perfectly
We could
possible.
be number 2.
We could be number 2.
I mean, it's great that we're such a crypto-friendly country, isn't it?
We were crypto
happen
hub,
to a bit, yeah,
Rishi's vision. The thing is we may not get that Bitcoin because there's a court case that's open with the Chinese government, and if they want the crypto or the Bitcoin back, then we would be obliged to make them whole. Also, under the proceeds of criminal, I always get that wrong. What is it? The POCA, right? We would have to sell it as soon as that court case concludes. So whatever happens, we're going to lose that Bitcoin and end up doing what Germany did. Sorry, depressing, but going to happen. The thing is Freddie has actually been writing, saying that we should actually change that.
Yeah, so actually, that's a good point. So one of our approaches to Rachel Reeves and to... Actually, I think I'm on my 3rd city minister since the Labour government came in now. Yeah. Yeah, the revolving door. One of our points there was that obviously, as Susie rightly points out, the Proceeds of Crime Act provides 2 things. Firstly, the victim should be made whole. The interesting thing here is that the victims in our particular case lost yuan, not Bitcoin. The criminals converted the fraudulently obtained yuan into Bitcoin. And so, strictly speaking, if you read POCA closely, we need to make them whole in yuan in 2014 prices plus adjusted for inflation and interest.
They had that recently as well, didn't they, with a police force up in the north?
Exactly that. Yeah, so we've got precedent as well. So what I think will happen is, if provided the outstanding criminal cases are concluded in favour of the prosecution, the government will then apply for a confiscation order. Once that confiscation order's obtained, they need to sell enough Bitcoin to make the victims whole, and then POCA provides the rest of the assets are sold, and half goes to the Home Office and half goes to law enforcement. So that's probably what's going to happen to that Bitcoin. We have, as Susie mentions, we have suggested that because this is such a strategically significant resource, perhaps the government should pass secondary legislation to empower the Secretary of State to use their discretion whether or not to be compelled to sell an asset. That's it's a relatively simple change, the legislation fairly easy to do by statutory instrument, but obviously much like Ed Miliband, the kind of reaction we get is a complete slam door in the face from our wonderful people in cabinet.
As long as Gordon Brown doesn't
Just
come
one
back.
point I'd like to make. Sorry, Charlie. One point is this is a perfect example of why Bitcoin is not good for criminals.
That's very true, actually. If only stupid criminals would use Bitcoin, I keep on pointing out when asked this question that why would you want to create a publicly searchable permanent record that you can't change or hide, which can then be used in court as evidence? You'd have to be pretty freaking stupid to want to do that. Just use dollars, like Evgeny Prigozhin, who had an account at JP Morgan and HSBC. That's not a joke, he did.
Yeah. Yeah, Isabel.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating talk. And thank you. Cheers. Yes, fascinating talk. Amazing. Different viewpoints as well. I guess the clues in the name, you focus on Bitcoin, but I would love to hear your view on Ethereum, Solana. Not so much the meme coin end, but, which is now already called sort of the blue chip cryptos. Is that something you're looking at? What's your view on those?
Well, I'm not sure you would want to hear my views on it, but I'll be polite.
You probably won't, actually, but
Just tell us as it is.
I think for me, crypto is so broad a term that it's almost unhelpful now. So a lot of our evidence to Parliament over the years has been that it's such a broad industry that calling everything crypto isn't particularly helpful. A JPEG is not the same as a meme coin. It's not the same as a stable coin. It's not the same as Bitcoin. So for me, Bitcoin is an emergent monetary asset. That's its product market fit. I'm a sort of free market fundamentalist, and I believe that most of the other coins are probably more akin to venture capital backed tech companies. And that's fine. I've worked in a venture capital backed tech company for ages. Some of them may find product market fit, some of them won't. EOS, for example, never found product market fit, and that's a dead chain now, effectively. So it's interesting you mentioned meme coins, because I have a lot of sympathy for meme coins on Solana. I think that's quite an honest entrant into the market, because if you want to gamble on a meme coin, go for it. I think that's fantastic. So some of these other things I think may find product market fit in the same way that any venture capital company, any tech company, any fintech may also find product market fit. For me, I do read about them, but largely as sort of academically. My focus is on Bitcoin as the monetary asset. I think some of them may find their market, and they may find a way of solving problems. But for me, the key thing is, and I've mentioned it earlier, I think we are collectively underestimating how severe a sovereign debt problem we have, and that's a really fundamental piece for me of why a non-state digital money is important. So that's not a very good answer.
No, it's great, and clearly more education needed, and that's why I think it's also great what you're doing, because I fully agree, everything gets thrown into the crypto pot. We would never say equities. No, it's like, what are we talking about? Manufacturing, finance, transport, whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly right. And in some ways, it's helpful, I think, to use an analogy for doing things on a computer. You could be watching a YouTube clip on a computer, or you could be working on an Excel sheet. You're using a computer to do both of those things, but those activities are extremely different from each other. And there's just a bit of category confusion, again, from our regulators and our politicians who think, oh, it's crypto, it must all be the same thing.
Simon.
What's Ethereum's product fit?
Well, that's a cracking question. I'd argue that Ethereum has now been replaced by Solana. So Bitcoin for me historically was effectively the 0 to 1 moment when it was it's the first time that a non-state monetary asset was successfully created that could function in that way. Everything else for me was more like a tech company, and I think Ethereum is a decent example of that. Ethereum, I'm a Bitcoin maximalist, but I quite like the idea of this decentralized world computer that Ethereum originally tried to be. It hasn't turned into that, And I think there are now other fast, if you want to do the things that Ethereum originally set out to do, I think there are other chains that do that faster and better and more cheaply. So I think I would, my view is that Ethereum is kind of more like a MySpace of cryptocurrency. So I would, if you're interested in doing stuff on Ethereum, I would say, there are other faster, quicker, better chains. Tron, for example. Actually, Tron is a good real-world example. So stablecoins you mentioned, hugely important, particularly in the global south, where there's a lot of dollar demand and not a lot of access to dollars. Ethereum used to be the platform of choice for Tether, and they've now largely moved to Tron because it's faster, cheaper. So Ethereum's lunch has been eaten in the stablecoin market by Tron, and Tether announced in January they're now going to be running that on the Lightning Network on Bitcoin, which is even faster and even cheaper. So yeah, I think you're at much more risk of being replaced by a newer, better, younger, sexier alternative if you're Ethereum.
Rishi. Yes. Thanks.
Regarding your views on stablecoin treasuries and so on, do you think this, you can have dollar dominance without necessarily, and dollar dominance is just volumes of transactions in dollars, not necessarily anything to do with dollar value. I mean, you could have an exported inflation, you could have a creation of a great deal of dollars, and some of those could be, backing stable coins. I mean, it could lead to an explosion of that. So do you think that stablecoin development, people have talked about its import for Bitcoin because it's a way in which crypto can exchange more easily and so on. But do you think actually that has an impact on Bitcoin relative to dollar because of the potential of excessive dollar issuance via stablecoin?
That's a fascinating question. You've reminded me of one way of looking at the stablecoin market, which is I saw an analogy recently with the emergence of the euro-dollar market, and effectively, obviously, the ability of non-US domiciled entities to create new dollars, leading to obviously the explosion in bluntly the amount, I suppose the total amount of dollars in circulation. I think for me that was quite a good analogy because I think something similar is happening at the moment. You're having a lot of private companies able to issue effectively dollar-backed tokens. In terms of how it might affect Bitcoin's price, I mean, one obvious problem that I think not just the dollar but all fiat currencies have is that they're obviously unlimited in supply, and so to the extent that an increase in the availability or the circulation of the number of dollars in circulation, if that increases, then obviously assets which can't be inflated in the same way might see a concomitant increase in their price. I mean, there's a just fairly obvious inflation point. Was there an additional sort of point to the?
No, I think it's it's concerning that nothing seems to stop the everlasting issuance. I think it's the path of least resistance. I don't see fiscal religion suddenly descending on the world, either in China or the US or
No, I agree.
So I'm sort of wondering, and then you've got the ECB also looking at stablecoin and so on. So I'm sort of wondering whether, what on earth we do about this ridiculous indebtedness that's ever increasing. And it seems to me that, some kind of hyper-issuance is a way, and this question of how you do that without, whilst fooling the people most of the time. I mean, the governments are always the greatest thieves of all, so.
I 100% agree with you, and you've summed up there one of my key worries at the moment. I've written a lot about this in public. I personally don't really see a way out of our current predicament without effectively either hyperinflation or continued debasement. I think we all know that no government that can issue its own currency and whose debts are denominated in its own currency is ever going to go bankrupt or going to go bust. Their reaction is to print and print and print. And I mentioned it, I grew up in a country where this happened aggressively, and I think it still holds the record for the percentage rate of inflation. If anyone has not read When Money Dies about the German hyperinflation in the 1920s, strongly recommend that. It's a terrifying, terrifying book, not least because with the advantage of hindsight, you know what happens next. It's a real horror story. And it's important, I think, to remember that most fiat currencies only I think their lifespan is about 40 years. We're in a weird position in the UK, and that sterling, I think, is still the oldest currency that's been in continuous existence. It's about 200 years old, our modern form of sterling. So fiat currencies die all the time. And it's difficult to see a way out of this without some form of debt jubilee, which I frankly don't think is likely, because it's important for us to remember that our national debt is someone else's asset, and it's paying them a nice coupon, I think 5.7% a couple of weeks ago. So I think you're completely right that the only way that governments are going to respond to this, I think, is through continual creation of more currency. And the logical conclusion of that is because the governments aren't going to come to save us, we individually, either as people or as wealth managers, need to take steps to protect ourselves and our clients.
Of course, it's also the argument for equity because in the end, stuff is the protector of value. So anything that has longevity as stuff excludes repricing of output by equities.
Well, yes, I agree with you as well.
Equity is priced.
We all like to think that, and we're always wrong.
Good. Anyone else? Yes,
Robin.
we'll make this the last one, I think.
Freddie, how early are we in terms of Bitcoin adoption?
That's a good question. Again, putting some numbers on it, the latest data we've seen from the FCA suggests that about 5 million adults in the UK hold Bitcoin. In the US, it's about 50 million. So significant. What's the population of the US? About 350 million, isn't it? So it's a decent chunk of people. So I think we're still early. There's still a reasonable amount of upside. And as we were just chatting there, the upside is probably, I tend to think of us as being on your standard S-curve of adoption. I reckon we're still in the lower slopes of that S-curve. I would hope that, actually this is a stupid hope, I was about to say if governments become fiscally responsible, but they obviously never will. So perhaps there's no top of the S-curve, maybe we just keep on going up. I think relatively early. I don't know how most people will feel about your own conversations in this sphere, but I'm still the weirdo in my friend group. And I still get laughed at parties for being into crypto. So I think we're still relatively early. Maybe early, not quite the early adopters, maybe early majority.
I'm 10 years older than you, so imagine what that feels like. I think on that note, we can all go upstairs and have a drink. We'll all be around to chat to Freddie. Freddie, thank you so much. It's been a really great chat.